We're going to be talking about what you're willing to give up to deliver on your dreams.
My name is Ade Hassan. I am the founder of a company called Nubian Skin.
Looking back, what advice would you give to people listening who are distracted by their job but have a dream and want to make it happen?
Ask yourself, do I really want this? Right? Like, just make it very clear. Like, do you want it? And if the answer is yes, then you just need to make a plan. Plot every single point along the way that you will need to get to where you want to go. So let's say you just need to register the company, and then literally just put in your calendar, like, fine, I'll research for next week, and then the following week I'm going to register the company, and then just get moving.
Thank you, GoDaddy, for sponsoring this podcast. You as a listener get 40% off. The code is down below. Welcome to the podcast today. Thank you so much for taking time out to share your knowledge with the audience today. We're going to be talking about what you're willing to give up to deliver on your dreams. And I know this is something you know a lot about. Perhaps we could kick off the podcast by you kindly telling the audience a little bit about yourself.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Ade Hassan. I am the founder of a company called Nubian Skin. And Nubian Skin is a very, very simple concept. It is multiple nudes or skin tones for people of color. So we're an underwear brand for men and women. We do lingerie, we do hosiery, more basic underwear, but essentially I could never find my own nude. If I wanted a nude bra or some nude tights and I'd go into a shop, they didn't have it. And so I decided to create Nubian Skin to address that gap in the market. And that's me in a nutshell.
Well, I can already tell you're very humble because it's Ade and they're saying MBE. You know, you've been recognized for your incredible work, what you've done to help so many people. And what was it like to get an MBE?
You know what? It was a complete shock because it was never something that was even on my radar. I sort of thought, like, I don't know, you had to do something incredible or, you know, be friends with the Prime Minister or whatever to get an MBE. And I remember when I got the letter saying, or my sister actually opened the letter and told me about it, and it said, you have been nominated to receive an MBE for services to fashion. Just that line, services to fashion, was like, I remember just bursting into tears, because it's one thing to sort of like work on something and be working really hard on it and be, you know, sort of like slogging away, and then to get something so amazing for services to an industry that you work in was just phenomenal.
I just listened to your TED Talk, and we'll put the link down below for anyone that wants to listen. I really was inspired by it. But you talk about this in the TED Talk a little bit about how you, I guess there's an element of like, you're humble. Every day you're scared is what you said in the TED Talk, but every day you also feel like going out there and you're making amazing things happen, and it's so exciting. The two things go hand in hand. And when you perhaps are working so hard, head down, you don't realize why you deserve that MBE, but you definitely do. You've helped so many people feel comfortable in their own skin. So I think that's pretty amazing. So I think I'd like to start off, if we could. I want to know a little bit about your family and your background and how you got here. But before we do that, let's go straight to like, what did you give up to achieve what you've achieved today?
Well, I suppose, oh goodness, it's almost, what are you still giving up, right? I think entrepreneurship has the most amazing PR. I think people look at it and they're like, oh, this is glamorous and sexy and I can work for myself and I'll make loads of money. But as most entrepreneurs know, that isn't the case. I mean, it is, you know, it is exciting and, you know, you can make money, but a lot of times you are just working really, really hard, and things don't go the way that you think, or success doesn't come as quickly as you want, or success doesn't look like what you think success should look like. And so I think in my case, it's being an entrepreneur has been an incredible experience, but it has meant one, giving up a lot of peace of mind. I think when you do not work for yourself and when you don't have the worry of other people's salaries and livelihoods depending on you, there's a lot of freedom that comes with that, right? So you can, you know that if you walk away from a job or if you decide that you want to do something else, there's a little bit less, I suppose, pain that goes into that decision. And also it's like you create something. So it's like a baby. It's like your child. And so you're always worried about it. You're always working on it. You're never fully switching off. And that's a pretty big mental load to handle. So I'd say, peace of mind, maybe especially at the beginning, work-life balance. I'm a bit better at it now than I was at the beginning. There was no balance at the beginning. And I suppose just what's the right word?
I was thinking it's
if you're not into risk.
Go ahead. Sorry. No, sorry. I was going to help you because I feel the pain of what you're trying to describe. So I was tempted to try and help describe it. But go on, you go ahead.
So if you're not into uncertainty and risk, I wouldn't recommend becoming an entrepreneur because there is a lot of uncertainty and there is a lot of risk. And so I suppose that's giving up stability and certainty.
Well, I think this is considering we're a pro entrepreneur podcast, I think we've literally every single one of our listeners highlighted why they shouldn't be one. And actually, you know what? It's really important to talk about this because I think sometimes entrepreneurship is glamorized, it is misrepresented. And so it is important perhaps to be like have informed consent of like what you're about to enter
Absolutely.
into, like it is like waking up in the middle of the Antarctic, isn't it? Like, and you're like, what's going on? But equally,
like, I don't know, but I've got a boat and I need to row.
Right? Yeah,
just
exactly.
Row.
And I'm sure there's fish underneath this ice if I can just figure out a way of digging through it. But I think it's a really interesting point to kind of highlight because I'm also someone that's always talking about like you should be your own boss at least once as an experience, right? And if you position it as an experience, maybe it's not so intimidating. But something you said in your TED talk also struck me. You talked about how you kind of a little bit described what you just described a minute ago. It was really hard. You gave up all this stuff, but there was something magical that came from all that pain. Let's call it that. And so talk about that for a second.
Yeah, and I realize that does sound a little bit negative talking about the trials of being an entrepreneur, but it is good to be realistic about it. But I am still an entrepreneur because there's opposites in everything, right? For every good, there's a bad, or for every bad, there's a good. And so for all of the sort of stress and the worry, there is also just like you're creating something, and that is amazing and powerful. And one of the things that I feel very, very strongly about now is legacy. And when you are an entrepreneur and when you start something, that enables you to build your legacy, which is phenomenal, right? Like you get the choice in building something and creating something. And so for me, I would say doing that, literally making my mark on the world in a way that I get to determine is one of the biggest benefits of entrepreneurship. So in my case, obviously with Nubian Skin, changing the industry, making it more inclusive is something that I will forever be proud of because I took the step to do that and create that. And it had, despite being a tiny business, it had a huge impact on the industry in general. And so and when I speak to my team, and sometimes, when you sort of get wrapped up in things and wrapped up in the trials, and then the team is like, oh, but I just love like the mission and the values, and you're like, oh my goodness, that's right, that is like I built that. And so that's I think that's something that you just can't, it's indescribable.
And so these pros and cons of being your own boss are again they're not talked about enough, so I really like talking about this. And I think legacy, actually, when you said it, I got like my hair stood up in my arms, like, because it's something that I think is really hard to also articulate. Legacy, it's a very personal thing, isn't it? But and what you just said there, I don't want the listeners to miss this, right? You said something I think is so core. What happens to entrepreneurs who have purpose is that even if you're not the one that ends up dominating the world with your brand, the fact that you have done this, other brands will then copy you, other brands will try to also help solve the problem. And even if you're not the one that ends up being the global brand that solves the problem, what affected you, what affects millions of people, is being solved because you started a movement. And that is very powerful. And I think something people should remember. That's why I always say to people, share your ideas, for example, because if you're not going to do it, someone else might, and then whatever that idea is meant to solve, the problem you feel passionate about will happen, right? So that's the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
If this podcast is inspiring you to start or grow a business, then I recommend you use Tailor Brands. They are our sponsor for this podcast, and they help you not only craft a brand, but design merchandise and so much more. In the last year, I've used this site for every single one of my businesses. I couldn't recommend them more. And we've even negotiated a 40% off discount code for you. Just use PEP, P-E-P, when using their website to make your booking. Now, let's get back to the podcast. And how did you find this purpose for yourself? I know. Again, you talked about it in the TED Talk, so I don't want to. People can go watch the TED Talk, but I'm really interested in. You mentioned it was a personal feeling, but since the TED Talk was 5 years old, you probably had time to reflect on it. Do you think it was part of your upbringing really made a difference? Because of course, you mentioned that your upbringing was quite inclusive. Actually, you didn't necessarily feel out of place. And maybe talk about that a little bit. Do you think when you review even deeper where this ideas come from, it's come from your upbringing?
I think the specific idea, right, the idea of I want a nude bra came from my personal experience in that I was going into places and wanting this product and it just didn't exist, and I was like, well, there's literally hundreds of millions of people probably billions, right, who have dark skin. Like, why why doesn't this exist? When it comes to, I suppose, so that's the specific concept of Nubian Skin. That's how that arose, was of a personal need. But being an entrepreneur in general, and sort of feeling like I was worthy of, or I deserved to have a product that catered to me, I think that was definitely influenced by my upbringing. Both my parents are entrepreneurs, and when you talk about legacy, especially with my father, he works in healthcare, he should do this podcast, right? Like, his legacy and the work that he's done for healthcare in Nigeria is like, wow, right? And my mum's been a successful entrepreneur. And so seeing that has definitely influenced me to want to be an entrepreneur, to want to do, want to make changes in the world, to want to leave an impact on the world. And then I grew up in a lot of different places. I grew up in the UK, we lived in Saudi Arabia, we lived in Nigeria for some pivotal moments of my life, in the US as well. And so in Nigeria, it was a very interesting experience as a Black person, as a Black woman, to be somewhere where race is a non-issue because everybody looks like you. So the experience that you would have, being in a country where most people are white, was the experience I was living because everybody was Black. And so it was... you just feel like, everything is looks like you, is made for you. And I think that's also really powerful, actually. Not having to compromise and not having to feel like you are other, but just being yourself completely. And that gives us very specific kind of confidence, which also then enabled me to go like, well, screw it. If nobody's doing it for me, I'm going to make sure it happens because I deserve it.
And like you said in the TED Talk, you grew up in Nigeria, so the top politicians, all look like you. The doctors and lawyers all look like you, and so that it's funny. I had a kind of the opposite experience. That I lived in England for 22 years, grew up here, and of course felt generally like I fitted in, and then I moved to Hong Kong and Asia, and it was quite interesting to suddenly be the other. It was definitely a humbling experience where you felt like you couldn't. I spent 20 years there, so eventually I did break in, but you feel like you're not part of the inner circle. Like there's things you're just not included in. The way everything is done is just not really designed to include you, and it's actually a very humbling experience to experience that. I think it kind of grounds you, doesn't it? I feel like it's probably a big part of your company culture, for example.
Yeah, because I think there's being an other in different scenarios is very nuanced. So like, I think Black people's experience in a predominantly white country would probably be very different from your experience as a white person in a predominantly Asian company or country. But as far as knowing what it feels like to be home, in quotations, is definitely something that bleeds into the ethos of Nubian Skin, like and that's something that I'm so proud of and that I just love, is the feeling of welcome and being included. Basically every shoot that we're on it feels like coming in for a hug. Like the models are all like, we want to shoot with Nubian Skin. It just like the vibe is so amazing because it's just in our DNA that we're like, if you are here, we are celebrating you. And I love that. And when we do events and when we've done pop-ups, that's the vibe. And it's just, it's such a beautiful thing. Like I wish I could bottle it. Because I always say, if you ever, no matter what you look like, if you want to feel good about yourself, come to a Nubian Skin shoot. Like, it's just phenomenal. I remember being 8.5 months pregnant and feeling like an absolute whale. And the whole, like the models and the photographer, I was doing a shoot for a campaign which eventually won a TFL competition, but they were all like, no, you've got to get in something and like, get in front of the camera. And I was like, absolutely not. Like I'm the person behind the camera. I don't do that. And it was really lovely to be on that side and be vulnerable in that way, but feel completely embraced by like love and good vibes. I mean, I could go on about this forever, but yes, that is something that I'm super proud of, and it's woven into the DNA of Nubian Skin, and it's all about being welcome and feeling home.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And to be honest, if you sold tickets to this experience, I think you could sell a lot of tickets. The way you describe it, I'm literally like, how can I get an invite to this? This really sounds amazing. I wanted to ask you again. I'm taking these questions from your TED talk. What you described there. I wanted to know more. What advice would you give to people listening who are distracted by their job? There's something you're talking in your TED talk about how you got distracted a few times by your very well paid, very high profile, role in finance. So how you got distracted, but looking back, what advice would you give to people listening who are distracted by their job but have a dream and want to make it happen? What's your view now looking back?
I think one, very, very much ask yourself, do I really want this? Right? Like just make very clear, like, do you want it? And if the answer is yes, then you just need to make a plan. And you can make several plans, because I think sometimes we feel like we need to make a plan, and then if things don't go according to that plan, we're like, oh well, all hope is lost, and then we sort of like, feel like it didn't work out. I think actually make multiple plans, but plot where you want to be. So let's say you want to go part-time maybe, and you want to sort of have like something small running on the side. Or maybe you want to go like full-time, all bells, and like, like you want to fundraise, you want to start this new amazing tech company. Just plot the end point, and then so that's like that's one end, and then plot where you are now, which could be maybe you've done some research, it could be literally you have nothing, but then literally, and I give this advice to everybody who asks, plot every single point along the way that you will need to get to where you want to go. Just plot it all out and then break it up into tiny little segments. So no matter what you want the company to look like at the end, you know that you've got to start somewhere. So let's say you just need to register the company. Literally, one segment is figure out how to register the company in your location, if you're in the UK, the US, wherever. And then so do the research, and then literally just put in your calendar, like, fine, I'll research for next week, and then the following week I'm going to register the company, or I'm going to get in touch with some lawyers who can register the company, or whatever you want to do. And literally break down every single milestone, and then break down every little task that you will have to do to get to that milestone, and then just start putting one foot and step in front of the other. Obviously, the end goal, but literally just do the one thing you need to do for that day or that week, and then just get moving.
Great tips. I think another thing I take from, again, listening to your TED talk that I think might help the audience is, and correct me if I'm wrong, just my interpretation of what you said, you talked about how you told a friend about your idea and she loved it, and then you went back into your corporate life and got distracted, and then she sent you a note one day saying, cannot wait to see you on the front of, I think it was Forbes or one of these magazines, and it sparked you. Now I guess the lesson I took from that story was that if you go and tell your closest friends you're doing it, they will encourage you and support you and help you keep your dreams alive and not get distracted. Do you think that's a fair sum up of your experience?
Yeah, I think I actually didn't tell very many people at all, but I did tell some key people. And I think you've got to strike that balance because I think sometimes you can overshare. And as an entrepreneur, there will always be people who are doubters, right? Like entrepreneurship just isn't their thing, and they don't get why you would leave a stable job to do something crazy. So I don't think you necessarily need to overshare to the point where you have people who are negative or doubters who are going to like kind of like dampen your dreams. But I think if there are people who are your natural cheerleaders, if you've got a small circle, I think you can tell them. And for me, that was my mum, my sister, and my friend Mira who sent me the card. But yeah, I think if there are people who you trust and who are people that really, really sort of like cheer you on, share with them because they'll want to see you fly, right? And if it's something that they can see that you're truly passionate and excited about, then they'll sort of help push you gently,
Gently.
but they'll help push you.
I like that. You mentioned earlier about not having balance when you first started the business, and then now kind of gaining it. I'm assuming motherhood helps with this in a way. You have to readjust, right?
Yeah.
But how do you get balance, if there's such a thing? Does it even exist?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because people talk about balance, and I think, and this is my personal opinion, I don't know that balance, like perfect balance, exists. I think that there are times where you can feel like you're in a little bit better control, and there are times where you're just like getting things done and you're dealing with the consequences later. At least that's been my experience. And so at the beginning, I didn't know anything and I was learning. I think sometimes, if we want to use the word balance, it comes from also just knowledge and experience because maybe you're not going to fly off the handle when something goes wrong just because you kind of know that you can deal with it and you've dealt with it before. Motherhood has been an amazing experience for me, but also a really interesting one because I had my son 6 weeks before the pandemic began, and I had him, thought I'd be able to take it easy, then had to furlough my staff, and then was doing every single role. Again, it was like starting all over again while handling a newborn. And so then for about 9 months, there was no balance again. And then I dealt with the consequences of that later when you sort of burn out majorly. But now I'm in a point where my team is solid. And I think when it comes to finding balance, having a supportive team, finding the right people is crucial. I can say that I'm definitely in the best space I've ever been when it comes to being able to delegate and feel like I can take a breath because I have a strong team. I think hiring the right team and having the right support system around you is vital, at least for me, for finding balance, because then you feel like you can trust people and you can delegate, and that just gives you a little bit more room to maneuver and to breathe and be creative.
Love it. Yeah. You said again, I'm referencing the TED Talk so much today. People don't need to listen to it now because I've talked about it so much, but they please do watch it. It's a really good TED Talk. It's down below. It's one of those gems you find, you realise that it should have tens of millions of views. I think it's so good. It's one of those things that's just a gem. But you said in there, like having a business is like having a baby that you can't give back. And the truth is, and as a mother, you'll know, and I've got a 4.5-year-old myself. Once you actually have a baby, you wouldn't want to give it back. I think that's, it comes with some pain, but you learn unconditional love. There's things that are just unbelievably special and about having a child, having a baby. But I'm sure, I think the other thing you mentioned, just going to recap, going over the podcast quickly, giving up peace of mind is a really interesting point you mentioned there. I think, again, I don't know what your experience is, just to sum up the podcast, but I have more peace of mind knowing what's happening with my business and knowing, no one can fire me, like only me can fire me. And there's something interesting in that freedom, right? Peace of mind starts off being, as you say, worrying about your staff and worrying. But once you've got it under control, you actually have more peace of mind.
I agree to an extent. And I think that's also just where I am in my journey as an entrepreneur, right? And where I am in my journey having a business. I think the peace of mind of knowing that you control your destiny is brilliant. I can be quite anxious, and so I worry a lot even if I don't need to worry. And so that's when you've got a business and you've got people, then obviously you naturally worry. But I do think as far as controlling your destiny and being in control of what happens, and yeah, absolutely. Being an entrepreneur, when especially if things are going well is it's amazing.
But being aware of it, knowing the pros and cons, do a list for yourself, because it is a very personal experience, isn't it? As you say. Look, I want to thank you for joining the podcast and sharing your knowledge. We're going to run a competition, folks. Luckily, Ade's offered a 1-hour mentorship with herself, which I think is an amazing prize. And all you have to do is go on social media, Instagram, and post up a picture of any picture that is you feeling comfortable in your own skin, and tag us. And we'll pick one winner to have mentorship. So thank you so much for offering that mentorship, and for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge, and for being so open about your journey, and for doing amazing things to empower people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Pep Talk. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow the Purposeful Project on all our social media channels, where we're giving away even more free business secrets and entrepreneurial value. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsor, GoDaddy, for powering this podcast. From naming a business to buying a domain name to building your website for free, GoDaddy has you covered. For 40% off GoDaddy tools, click the link in the podcast note below and use the code GDXPepTalk. See you next time, entrepreneurs, and remember, you're not alone.